Going to continue on with our story time with The Star's My Destination by Alfred Bester. I hope you like the prologue. Here comes Chapter 1. Chapter 1. He was 170 days, dying and not dead yet. He fought for survival with the passion of a beast in a trap. He was delirious and rotting, but occasionally his primitive mind emerged from the burning nightmare of survival into something resembling sanity. Then he lifted his mute face to eternity and muttered, "What's the matter, me? Help. Ye heels, help is all." Blasphemy came easy to him. It was half his speech, all his life. He had been raised in the gutter school of the 24th century and spoke nothing more than gutter tongue. Of all the brutes in the world, he was the least valuable alive and the most likely to live. So he struggled to survive and prayed in blasphemy, but occasionally his raveling mind leaped backward 30 years to his childhood, and he remembered a nursery jingle. Gullyfoyle is my name, terror is my nation, deep space is my dwelling space, and death my destination. He was Gulliver Foyle, mechanic, mate, 3rd class, 30 years old, big-boned and rough, and 170 days adrift in space. He was Gully Foyle, the oiler, wiper, bunkerman, too easy for trouble, too slow for fun, too empty for friendship, too lazy for love. His lethargic outlines of his character even showed in the official Merchant Marine records. Foyle, Gulliver, AS 128-127 006. Education, none. Skills, none. Merits, none. Recommendations, none. Personal comments. A man of physical strength and intellectual potential, stunted by lack of ambition. Energizes at a minimum. The stereotype common man. Some unexpected shock might possibly awaken him, but Psyche cannot find a key. Do not recommend for further promotion. Foyle has reached a dead end. He had reached a dead end. He had been content to drift from moment to moment of existence for 30 years, like some heavily armored creature, sluggish and indifferent. Gully Foyle, the stereotype common man. But now he was adrift in space for 170 days, and the key to his awakening was in the lock. Presently it would turn and open the door to the Holocaust. The spaceship Nomad drifted halfway between Mars and Jupiter. Whatever war catastrophe had wrecked it, it had taken a sleek steel rocket 100 yards long and 100 feet broad and mangled it into a skeleton, on which was mounted the remains of a cabin, holds and decks and bulkheads. Great rents in the hull were a blaze of light on the sun side and frosty blotches of stars on the dark side. The SS Nomad was a weightless emptiness of a blinding sun and jet shadow, frozen and silent. The wreck was filled with a floating conglomerate of frozen debris that hung within the destroyed vessel like an instantaneous photograph of an explosion. The minute gravitational attraction of the bits of rubble for each other was slowly drawing them into clusters, which were periodically torn apart by the passage through them of the one survivor still alive in the wreck. Gulliver Foyle, AS 128-I127 006. He lived in the only airtight room left intact in the wreck, a tool locker of the main deck corridor. The locker was just 4 feet wide and 4 feet deep and 9 feet high. It was the size of a giant's coffin. 600 years before, it had been judged the most exquisite oriental torture to imprison a man in a cage of that size for weeks. Yet Foyle had existed in that lifeless cage for 5 months, 20 days, and 4 hours. Who are you? Gully Foyle is my name. Where are you from? Terra is my nation. Where are you now? Deep space is my dwelling place. Where are you bound? Death's my destination. On the 170th day of his fight for survival, Foyle answered these questions and awoke. His heart hammered in his throat, burned, and he groped in the dark for the air tank, which he shared his coffin with him and checked it. The tank was empty. Another would have to be moved in at once, so this day would commence with an extra skirmish with death, which Foyle accepted with mute endurance. He fell through the locker shelves and located the torn spacesuit. It was the only one aboard the Nomad, and Foyle no longer remembered where and how he found it. He had sealed the Terror with emergency spray, but had no way of refilling and replacing the empty oxygen cartridges on the back. Foyle got into the suit. It would hold enough air from the locker to allow him 5 minutes in vacuum. No more. Foyle opened the locker and plunged into the dark black frost of space. The air in the locker puffed out with him, and it was the moisture congealed in a tiny snow cloud that drifted down the torn main deck corridor. Foyle heaved the exhausted air tank and floated out of the locker and abandoned it. 1 minute was gone. He turned and propelled himself through the floating debris towards the hatch of the ballast hold. He did not run. His gait was the unique locomotion of freefall and weightlessness, thrust with foot and elbow and hand against deck, wall and corner, slow motion darting through space like a bat flying underwater. Foyle shot through the hatch into the dark ballast hold. 2 minutes were gone. Like all spaceships, the Nomad was ballasted and stiffened, with the mast of her gas tanks laid down the length of her keel like a long slumber raft tapped at the sides by a labyrinth of pipe fittings. Foyle took a minute disconnecting an air tank. He had no way of knowing whether it was full or already exhausted, whether he would fight it back to the locker only to discover that it was empty and his life ended. Once a week he endured this game of space poker. There was a roaring in his ears, and the spacesuit was rapidly going foul. He yanked the massy cylinder towards the ballast hatch and ducked and let it sail over his head, and he thrust himself after it. He swung the tank through the hatch. 4 minutes had elapsed, and he was shaking and blacking out. He guided the tank down the main deck corridor and bullied it through the locker door. He slammed the locked door, dogged it, and found a hammer on the shelf and swung it thrice at the frozen tank to loosen the valve. Foyle twisted the hand grimly. With the last of his strength, he unsealed the helmet of his spacesuit, and lest he suffocate within the suit while the locker filled with air. If the tank did contain air, he fainted, as he had fainted so often before, never knowing whether this was death. Who are you? Gully Foyle. Where are you from? Terra. Where are you now? Space. Where are you bound? He awoke. He was alive. He wasted no time on prayers or thanks, but continued the business of survival. In the darkness, he explored the locker shelves, where he kept his rations. There were only a few packets left. Since he was already wearing the patched spacesuit, he might as well run the gauntlet of the vacuum again and replenish his supplies. He flooded the spaceship with air from the tank and resealed his helmet, and sailed out into the frost and light again. He squirmed down the main deck corridor and ascended the remains of the stairway to the control deck, which was no more than a roofed corridor in space. Most of the walls were destroyed. With the sun on his right and the stars on his left, Foyle shot aft towards the galley storeroom. Halfway down the corridor, he passed the doorframe, still standing foursquare, deck and roof. The leaf still hung on its hinges, half open, a door to nowhere. Behind it was all space and steady stars. As Foyle passed the door, he had a quick view of himself reflected on the polished chrome leaf. Gully Foyle, a giant black creature, bearded and crusted with dried blood and filth, emaciated, with sick, patient eyes, and followed always by the stream of floating debris. The raffle disturbed by his motion, and followed him through space like a tail of a festering comet. Foyle turned to the galley storeroom and began looting with methodical speed, a 5 months habit. Most of the bottled goods were frozen solid and exploded. Many of the canned goods had lost their containers, for tin crumbles to dust in the absolute zero of space. Foyle gathered up rations, packets, concentrates, and chunks of ice from the burst water tank. He threw everything in a large copper cauldron, and then turned and darted out of the storeroom, carrying the cauldron. At the door to nowhere, Foyle glanced at himself again, reflected in the chrome leaf, framed in the stars. Then he stopped his motion in bewilderment. He stared at the stars behind the door, which had become familiar friends after 5 months. There was an intruder among them, a comet it seemed, with the invisible head and short spurting tail. Then Foyle realized that he was staring at a spaceship, stern rockets flaring as it accelerated sunwards on a course that must pass him. "No," he muttered. "No, man, no." He was continuing to suffer from hallucinations. He turned to resume the journey back to his coffin. Then he looked again. It was still a spaceship, the stern rockets flaring as it accelerated on a sunward course, which must past him. He discussed the illusion with eternity. 6 months already, he said in gutter tongue. Is it now? You listen me, Heels. I'm talking a deal is all. I look again, sweet Heels. If it's a ship, I'm yours. You own me. If it's a gaff man, if it's no ship, I unseal right now and blow my guts. We both play square, us. Now reach me the sign. Yes or no is all. And he looked for a third time. And for the third time, he saw a spaceship, stern rockets flaring as it accelerated on a sunward course that must past him. It was a sign. He believed it. He was saved. Foyle shoved off and went hurling down the control deck corridor towards the bridge. But at the companionway stairs, he restrained himself. He could not remain conscious for more than a few moments without refilling his spacesuit. He gave the approaching spare ship one fleeting look and shot down the tool locker and pumped his suit full. He mounted the control bridge. Through the starboard observation port, he saw the spaceship, stern rockets still flaring, evidently making a major alteration in course, for it was bearing down on him very slowly. On the panel marked flares, Foyle pressed the distress button. There was a 3-second pause, which he suffered. Then white radiance blinded him as the distress signal went off. 3 triple bursts. 9 prayers for help. Foyle pressed the button twice again. Twice more the flares flashed in space, while the radioactives incorporated their combustion, set in a static howl that must register on any waveband and any receiver. The stranger's jet cut off. He had been seen. He would be saved. He was reborn, exalted. Foyle darted past the locker and replenished his spacesuit again, and he began to weep. He started to gather his possessions, a face of clock he kept wound just to listen to the ticking, a lug wrench with a hand-shaped handle that he would hold in lonely moments, an egg sliver upon whose wires he would pluck primitive tunes. He dropped them in his excitement and hunted for them in the dark, and then began to laugh at himself. He filled his space with air once more and capered back to the bridge and punched the flare labeled Rescue from the hull of the Nomad, shot a sunlit that burst and hung, flooding miles of space with harsh white light. Come on, baby, you, Foyle crooned. Hurry up, man. Come on, baby you. Like a ghost torpedo, the stranger slid into the outermost room of light, approaching slowly, looking him over. For a moment, Foyle's heart constricted. The ship was behaving so cautiously he feared that she was an enemy vessel of the outer satellites. Then he saw the famous red and blue emblem on her side, the trademark of the mighty industrial clan Prestine. Prestine of terror. Powerful, munificent, beneficent, and he knew that this was a sister ship for the Nomad. Also Prestine owned. He knew this was an angel from space hovering over him. Sweet sister, Foyle crooned. Baby angel, fly away home with me. The ship came abreast of Foyle, illuminated on its ports along its side, glowing in friendly light. Its name registered, number clearly visible, illuminated figures on the hull. Vorga T. 1339. The ship was alongside him. In a moment, passing him in a second, disappearing in a third. The sister had spurned him. The angel abandoned him. Foyle stopped dancing and crooning. He stared in dismay and leaped to the flare panel and slapped buttons, distress signals, landing, takeoff, quarantine flares burst from the hull of the Nomad in madness of white and green and red light, pulsing and pleading. And the Vorga T 1339 passed silently and implacably, stern jets flaring again as it accelerated on a sunward course. So in 5 seconds, he was born, he had lived, and he had died. After 30 years of existence and 6 months of torture, Gully Foyle, the stereotyped common man, was no more. The key had been turned in his lock of his soul forever, and the door was opened. What emerged expunged the common man forever. You passed me by, he said with slow mounting flurry. You leave me to rot like a dog. You leave me die. Vorga T 1339. No, I get out of here, me. I follow you, Vorga. I find you, Yorga. I pay you back, me. I rot you. I kill you, Vorga. I kill you deadly. The acid of fury ran through him, eating away the brutal patience and sluggishness that had made him a cipher of Gallifloyl, precipitating a chain reaction that would make an infernal machine of Gallifloyl. He was dedicated. Vorga, I kill you deadly. He did what the cipher could not do. He rescued himself. For 2 days, he combed the wreckage in 5-minute forays and devised a harness for his shoulders. He attached the air tank to the harness and connected the tank to a spacesuit helmet with an improvised hose. He wriggled through space like an ant dragging a log. But he had freedom, the freedom of the nomad for all time. He thought. In the control bridge, he taught himself to use the navigation instruments that were still unbroken, studying the standard manuals that littered the wrecked navigation room. In 10 years of his service into space, he had never dreamed of attempting such a thing, despite the rewards of promotion and pay. But now he had Vorga T-1339 as a reward to him. He took sights. The Nomad was drifting in space on the ecliptic 300 million miles from the sun. Before him were a spread of constellations, Perseus, Andromeda, and Pisces. Hanging almost in the foreground was a dusty orange spot that was Jupiter, distinctly a planetary disk to the naked eye. With any luck, he would make a course for Jupiter and rescue. Jupiter was not, and could never be, habitable. Like all the other outer planets beyond the asteroid orbits, its frozen mass of methane and ammonia, but its 4 largest satellites swarmed with cities and populations, now at war with the inner planets. He would be a war prisoner, but he had to stay alive to settle accounts with the Vorga T-1339. Vorga inspected the engine room for the Nomad. There was high-thrust fuel remaining in the tanks, and one of the 4 tail jets was still in operative condition. Foyle found the engine room manuals and studied them. He repaired the connection between the fuel tanks and the one jet chamber. The tanks were on the sun side of the wreckage and warmed above freezing point. The high thrust was still liquid, but it would not flow. In freefall, there was no gravity to draw fuel in the pipes. Foyle studied the space manual and learned something about theoretical gravity. If he could put the Nomad into a spin, centrifugal force would impart enough navigation to the ship to draw fuel down the combustion chamber of the jet. If he could fire the combustion chamber, the unequal thrust of one jet would impart a spin to the Nomad. But he couldn't get fire to the jet without first having the spin, and he couldn't have a spin without first firing the jet. He thought his way out of a deadlock. He was inspired by Vorga. Foyle opened the drainage petcock in the combustion chamber of the jet and tortuously filled the chamber with fuel by hand. He'd primed the pump. Now, if he ignited the fuel, it would fire long enough to impart a spin and start gravity. Then the flow of the tanks should commence, and the rocket would continue. He tried matches. Matches would not burn in the vacuum of space. He tried flint and steel. Sparks would not glow in absolute zero space. He thought of red-hot filaments. He had no electric power of any description aboard the Nomad to make the filament red-hot. He found texts and read. Although he was blacking out frequently and close to complete collapse, he thought and planned. He was inspired by the greatness of Vorga. Foyle bought ice from the galley tanks and melted it and added water to the jet combustion chamber. The fuel and the water were non-miscible, and they did not mix. The water floated on a thin layer over the fuel. From the chemical stores, Foyle brought a silvery bit of wire, pure sodium metal. He poked the wire through the open petcock. Sodium ignited when it touched the water in a flare with a high heat. The heat touched off the high thrust, which burned the needle flame from the petcock. Foyle closed the petcock with a wrench. The ignition held in the chamber, and the lone aft jet slammed out a flame that was soundless vibration that shook the ship. The aft-center thrust of the jet twisted the Nomad in a slow spin. The torque imparted a slight gravity. The weight returned. The floating debris that cluttered the hull fell to the decks, walls, and ceilings, and the gravity kept the fuel feeding from the tanks to the combustion chamber. Foyle wasted no time on cheers. He left the engine room and struggled toward, in desperate haste, for the final fatal observation from the control bridge. This would tell him whether the Nomad was committed into a wild plunge into the no return of deep space, or a course for Jupiter and rescue. The slight gravity made his air tank almost impossible to drag. The sudden forward surge of acceleration shook loose masses of debris, which flew backward on the Nomad, as Foyle struggled up the companionway stairs to the control deck. The rubble from the bridge came hurtling back down the corridor and smashed into him. He caught in his tumbleweed of space and rolled the length of the empty corridor, broad against the galley's bulkhead, with an impact that shattered his last hold on consciousness. He lay pinned to the center of half a ton of the wreckage, helpless, barely alive, but still raging for vengeance. Who are you? Where are you from? Where are you now? Where are you bound?